Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Hope everybody's doing well. I just wanted to do a recap on last week's discussion with Daniel Rogers on Tristan Gabriel's YouTube channel, and just kind of give some thoughts and give a little recap. If those of you who haven't watched it, check it out. It's over 3 hours, so I'm sure you'll have to do it in some parts, but it was a lengthy discussion on Israel only versus full preterism, with a bunch of different topics thrown in as well. Obviously the debate went really well, and IO really dominated. And you can, if you disagree with that, you have the right to do that. But when we're examining the Bible from an intellectual standpoint, from an honest standpoint, one has to admit that IO is the only logical conclusion, with obviously an AD 70 termination. There is no other way that you can come away from that story thinking anything other than that, when you really look at what it says, and when you consider the context and the trajectory and the foundational points that we have in the story, right? For instance, I showed Dan in the discussion that in Abraham, the accounts of Abraham back in Genesis had absolutely nothing to do with spiritual descendants whatsoever. Not one iota, not even the slightest. And Dan had no arguments, no text that he used to prove spiritual Israelites are, valid today. He threw out a couple of things. I can't remember what it was, but they really were not. I don't even remember them. That's how insignificant they were. So he had nothing. He just spoke oftentimes and, filled the gap with words, basically, just, word fillers. So anyway, I asked him to prove that. He couldn't do it. And I showed him how when God makes his promise to Abraham that in his literal descendants, many nations would be blessed, right? I showed him how that was physical descendants, and I showed him that it also said that these descendants, and these physical descendants who were going to be blessed beyond measure, he's setting this up, they would become like the stars in heaven in number, the stars of heaven in number. They would be very numerous, very great. They would blossom into a number that was unimaginable, and they would be strong, and God would give the gates of their enemies into their hands, right? They would be a dominant force because he would go before them and wipe away all their enemies. And sure enough, we see this happening all the way throughout the Old Testament, right? It's just the whole story. Israel's just a conquering people. They are a ethno-religious cult who basically considered the outside world to be pigs and filthy and dirty and vile, and they wanted nothing to do with them. In fact, their law was such that God commanded that they not intermingle and, be involved in these different outside nations, right? They were to be pure. They were to be holy. They were a chosen holy people set apart for his purpose, right? And they weren't chosen to evangelize, right? I asked Daniel to show me a passage on that, anything that would show Old Covenant Israel being commanded by God to evangelize nations around them. He couldn't do it. Of course, I knew he couldn't do it, and that's why I asked him to do it. But anyway, what you actually find in the Old Testament is the exact opposite. You find God commanding them to keep themselves pure, to keep themselves separate from these people, to not intermingle, to by no means marry anyone other than one of their own people. So you have all these laws set up, and of course Israel breaks those laws, and that's the whole point of the story. It's, transgression, restoration, transgression, restoration. It just goes on and on and on. But you have that set up with Abraham, right? And I showed him how God promises that those who blessed these descendants, Abraham's seed, those who blessed them would be blessed, and those who cursed them would also be cursed. So it's a twofold deal. These individuals who were going to blossom to a great number, which, oh, by the way, is fulfilled in Old Covenant Israel. If you look at the Old Testament texts, we see that Old Covenant Israel actually fulfills that in every sense of the word, right? At least a dozen times. And I gave the example of Deuteronomy. I think it's just chapter 1 straight away in Deuteronomy. Moses comes out in front of the massive congregation of the 12 tribes, the people, and he says, Israel, here you are today standing as the stars of heaven in number. In other words, here you are today, Israel, having become what God promised Abraham's descendants would become, right? And this is how we can understand that Israel is fulfilling that promise as the chosen seed, the seed of promise. I mean, Paul calls them that straight out in the New Testament. So these were the ones who were given the promise. Paul says, for the promise, for the hope of the fathers, the promise of resurrection, I stand before you in Acts. So it's all over the place. And Daniel tried to, flail and make some arguments that, basically stated that characters outside of Israel sometimes received grace or received a blessing from Israel's God. I mean, yeah, no shit. And this is what I told him, and he didn't seem to pick up on it. But when I showed him that God would bless those who bless thee, I showed him that those who dealt graciously and dealt carefully with the people of Israel sometimes received a reward from God. He quoted the book of Ruth, or Ruth's account, I forget what it was, but maybe Ruth, I don't know, maybe chapter 2, I'm not really sure what passage it was, and I took him there and I showed him that it says nothing of the sort, right? To equate what happened with the Ruth account, where it literally just says that she would receive a reward for what she did, it says nothing about resurrection. It says nothing about restoration. In fact, Ruth wouldn't even fit into the New Testament restoration model, because the New Testament restoration model was specifically for the first century, the last days. Ruth was long dead by then. So I don't know why they keep going to Ruth, when in fact Ruth is just another example of God blessing those who blessed Israel. Again, tying back to the original foundational promise, right? Which, by the way, Paul in the New Testament states that nothing could annul or add to or take away or anything to the promise made at Abraham, which is about Israel, as I just showed. So if nothing at all, Paul goes, emphatically to declare that nothing at all can separate them from the love of God. Nothing at all can change their status as elect, right? God wills it. God does as he pleases, right? Nothing at all. And so nothing could be added to that promise. And you know what that means, right? If the promise was originally made about the 12 tribes of Israel, which we know it was, because long before proselytes or anybody came to be, the Israelites fulfilled these promises. They possessed the gates of their enemies. They were a numerable multitude. They were called like the stars in heaven in number, and like the sand on the seashore numerous times. It's almost as if the Old Testament is just giving you that shaken baby syndrome and saying, hey, look here, look here. I'm telling you who Abraham's chosen seed was. It's Israel. They're the ones. It's not you today as a spiritual Israelite who thinks that the stars in heaven represents all people all over the globe in 2025. No, it doesn't. That was fulfilled in Israel. Okay, and the story is desperately trying to show you that. But we're so hung up on being a part of it that we will ignore the most plain things and basically toss intellectual honesty and self-dignity in the trash to believe something that's clearly not about us, right? Where we're hijacking a ethno-religious cult story. So anyway, he fared very badly when it came to Abraham and what I showed there. And he, like I said, tried to bring up foreigners. But again, the point was just everything ties back to that original promise that he would bless those who blessed Israel and he would curse those who curse Israel. But these things are not to be, these Old Testament accounts of that happening, like Ruth and like, God supposedly wiping out these towns and regions around the Babylonian Empire and in judgment because they cursed Israel, because they oppressed Israel, because they took Israel captive. I mean, that's all over Ezekiel and all the prophetic accounts, by the way. But that's all tying back to that Genesis promise. Everything ties back to that Genesis promise, and it's always about Israel. So, trying to argue that is tough, right? And of course, like I mentioned, we're dealing with the New Testament last day salvation mission. That's the core of what we're talking about, because Jesus came at that time and he changed this message, and now these Christians today are proclaiming that message, saying that we're saved of something, but that has nothing to do with Ruth. Okay, Ruth was long before. Ruth was a detail in Israel's story written by Second Temple Jews, and who knows if it's even true. So anyway, I asked Daniel what he was saved from today. He said he was saved from himself. Typical answer when you have no answer. I've gotten it numerous times. I knew it was coming. I knew he couldn't answer it, because if he said I'm saved from the law, then he knows I'm going to ask him to define what those laws are, and he can't do it. And the Bible is also clear that where there is no law, there's no imputation of sin. Sin was in the world before the law, but sin was not imputed where there was no law. So it was the law that always brought the imputation, the condemnation, the guilt, and the death in this story. And it really was the ministry of death. I mean, it called for death. It was the death penalty. Many things required the death penalty in this law. Simple things that we would think are pretty trivial, but based on this system of bondage that Israel was under, they were held to some pretty strict standards, which is why it was a curse. But it would also be a blessing. So you can see how the story is very, very tight-knit. When we got to Romans 9, Daniel exhibited pure dishonesty by trying to argue, well, first of all, realizing that he was trapped, realizing that he couldn't go anywhere. So the only place he decided to go was that he believed that the Israelites came out from the nations, but he did not believe that the Israelites were the nations, right? They didn't become the nations. They came out from. So essentially, he's got Israelites scattered in the nations, living as, I guess, Gentiles, right? Because they're not Jews, right? Because Paul obviously compares the Jews to the Gentiles there when he quotes Hosea. So he's talking about Gentiles, non-law practicing individuals. And he says that they're the Israelites. He uses 3 different passages to tie that together. And so Daniel says, yeah, well, surely he's talking about Israelites coming back from the nations, but that doesn't mean that Israelites were the nations, right? They didn't become the nations. And so what I did is I kind of played with them for a little while on that and made sure people understood how asinine of a view that is. I mean, they came out from the nations, but they weren't the nations. Okay, so what were they? So anyway, and how do you differentiate, right? Like, so the fullness of nations was what? Right? The fullness of nations was what? Was it all of the Israelites coming out of the nations? Or was it all of the Israelites coming out of the nations plus random Gentiles who came out of the nations? So, I mean, you see how stupid it is, right? Clearly it was all of Israel who was living in the nations as pagans, as Gentiles, and they were being gathered back. They were once not a people, but had now been restored and received mercy, which I showed Daniel. Deuteronomy 4 predicts this. It says, in the latter days, you Israelites will be scattered abroad in various nations, worshiping wood and stone, the work of men's hands. That's non-Jew, folks. That's idolizing, paganized Israelites, worshiping idols, the image, the work of men's hands. And Moses predicted that. So this is not a secret, right? These are non-Jew Israelites living in the nations, according to Deuteronomy 4. But notice what Moses says in Deuteronomy 4. He follows that up by saying, but God will turn when you turn to him, and he will have mercy upon you, and he will remember the covenant that he made with your fathers. So there it is, right? There's the promise. He's promising Israelites that they would be living as the nations. God would turn, have mercy on them, call them back because of what? Because he remembers the covenant promise made to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All the way back to Abraham, beautifully. And so this is the vein that the story travels forth in, based on that promise, and this is the chosen seed. It's Israel. Paul said Christ came to give forgiveness of sins and repentance to Israel. He said God raised up for Israel a Savior, Jesus. I mean, these are the words of Paul. So clearly we need to get a better understanding of who the nations are, because they both define them as the Gentiles, as Israel, I should say, the lost Israelites. And obviously my theory on that is a clear and undeniable tie back to Genesis 48. This is how I see the Bible. You had Genesis 12 to 17. You have the promise being made, right? That from Abraham's body, this chosen seed, descendants would come. And they would, possess the gates of their enemies. They would grow to an innumerable number. These are all the promises given about that seed. And so clearly we know it's not Jesus, right? Jesus was not going to grow to an innumerable number, and Jesus was not going to possess the gates of his enemies. And it was Israel. And we see Israel fulfilling that, right? The 12 tribes, plural, not one person, plural. That was the chosen seed. And so you have that set up in Genesis 12 to 17, but then in Genesis 48, as we go forward in the story, just before, things get spicy, we see this additional key core promise where Jacob, before he dies, right? Jacob's huge. You could argue Jacob's just as important as Abraham. He's the father of Israel. He is Israel. Israel came from his loins. And oftentimes Israel's referred to as Jacob. But anyway, Jacob puts his hand on the heads of Ephraim, the head of Ephraim, who is Joseph's son. And he says that, he says Manasseh would be great and have a blessing, but Ephraim would be incredibly numerous and incredibly blessed, and his descendants would become a fullness of nations. So there's the promise, right? You have the promise from Abraham that in his descendants many nations would be blessed. As you go forward, you have the promise given by Jacob that in Ephraim's descendants would come a fullness of nations. So clearly we see that Ephraim's descendants, the fullness of nations, was going to be the agent by which the promise that Abraham's descendants would become, many nations. The promise that in Abraham's descendants many nations would be blessed. That's how that promise came to fulfillment, through the agent of Ephraim's descendants. And sure enough, in Romans 11, Paul is seeking that very same fullness of nations in an ideal, type of way. I mean, this is a story, folks. Of course, what would you expect? It's finishing the deal. It's finalizing it. So Paul says that when the fullness of the nations come in, all Israel will be saved. Clearly, matching what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse when he said that the gospel of the kingdom will go to all nations and then the end will come. So everything fits together just magically, doesn't it? Paul was searching for the fullness of the nations so that all Israel would be saved. And all Israel could not be saved until the fullness of nations came in. Clearly, the fullness of nations is Ephraim's descendants in fulfillment of Genesis 48, which in my opinion is an incredibly important promise that people look right over. And so Dan had really nothing to say about that. I didn't really press him on that. I brought up Genesis 48 just to show him how stupid his argument was about them coming out from the nations but not being the nations. I showed him how the literal promise there by Jacob was that Ephraim's descendants, that's Israelites, would, quote, become a fullness of nations. Become. Not be among, not, come out from, but literally become a fullness of nations. It can't be any more clear. Yes, they came out from the nations, and that's because they were the nations. The nations in view, the nations getting the gospel, the nations receiving mercy were the Israelites. Again, ideal story. Doesn't care much for you understanding how these things could take place. Like, how could the Israelites be preserved and be found and all this? Well, it gives you answers like the Holy Spirit, who is a helper. Hold on. But it doesn't care that you don't have the answers, right? I mean, this is a story. It's just like when you go watch a movie, it doesn't care that you don't have all the answers, but you're following the trajectory. You're following the baseline. And that's what the Bible is, too. So it's Israel's story, and I showed that to Dan. And, he really just didn't bring anything to the table. And I only gave him the tip. I mean, that's the crazy part. Like, I didn't even take him into some of these other things, like 1 Corinthians 10, all of our fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. I didn't really tie it up for him. I didn't hammer him much on Ephesians, Colossians, Galatians, which are all incredibly Mosaic law-based epistles written to those who are guilty of violating and trespassing said law. I really didn't get into it. I did show him 1 Peter, which obviously started sweating, as someone said in the comments. I could see that all along. I mean, he was under the gun. Like, dude did not look healthy by the end of that night. But, he was a good sport about it. He has to be, right? Because he's a pulpit politician. But what was interesting is he came out the other day, same night actually, he came out with a video saying that he's not a full preterist, I guess, anymore. So he probably realized leading up to this discussion that it was going to go bad for him, and that if he held on to the full preterist paradigm too tightly, it would go extra bad for him. So that's my take on it. It's a little bit of damage control, saying, hey, there's got to be more. And that was what his video was all about. It was 20 minutes of, pulpit politician, where he stood up there and, put that little thumb out and made everybody feel, warm and fuzzy with these Christian buzzwords and taglines that are always used. And, people need God's love and, really profound stuff that you can get at just about any local pulpit. But he's, that's his approach now. It's just, there's got to be more. It's not scriptural based, but there's got to be more. So, okay, fair enough. But when I commented on the video and he deleted the comment, it said a lot, because I called him out for it. I called him out for the 20 minutes of no scriptural support. I called him out for his butchering of Revelation 20 to 22 by saying it's post-70, when in fact it's actually pre-70. The leaves of the tree going out for the healing of the nations was relevant to when the nations were getting the gospel. Jesus said this gospel of the kingdom will go to all nations and then the end will come, clearly putting the healing of the nations prior to the end, or else it makes no sense. We have the, what was the other one? The raising of all of those who were Christ on the last day, and he would not lose one. I mean, when was the last day? Dan admits it was the fall of Jerusalem, so therefore Dan admits that all those who were Christ, without the exception of even one, would be raised on that last day. So, there's a lot of problems, but I didn't respect the fact that he wouldn't let my comments be posted and seen on his videos. That's pretty telling, unless there's some kind of blockage on it and he has to accept it, but who knows. But as of today, it's not there. I showed him 1 Peter. He had nothing to say about it. He agreed it was Israel. I showed him the next chapter, 1 Peter chapter 2, how Peter again applies Hosea's prophecy to those he's writing to, these exiles in these various nations, which, by the way, are the same nations Paul wrote to: Galatia, Ephesus, Asia Minor. And so, basically, they're both agreeing that these are Israelites fulfilling the promise that Hosea made. And obviously this fulfills Isaiah 49, where the light was going out to the nations so that God's salvation would reach the ends of the earth. Of course it did. That's the whole point, right? Israel was in darkness. Jesus was commanding them to seek his elect from the farthest corners of heaven. So, of course, this is light going to the nations so that his salvation would reach the ends of the earth. He's saving his people. And the light is reaching them in dark places. So anyway, overall, I thought, IO dominated. Obviously, anyone with a brain and 2 ears can see that or hear that. But I commend Dan for stepping up regardless and, taking one on the chin. But it didn't bode well for full preterism or Christianity as a whole. So anyway, I'm going to stop ranting. Just got to my location. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Give it a like, a rooski, leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of the live. And we'll catch you on that flip side. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.